Thank you for joining today's webinar on phishing, counterfeiting, and misinformation scams with COVID-19. Today's webinar is hosted by CSC Global, a signatory of the Cybersecurity Tech Accord. CSC is the trusted partner of choice for Forbes Global 2000 companies and 100 best global brands for domain name management, domain name system services, digital certificate management, as well as digital brand and fraud protection solutions. Last year, the Cybersecurity Tech Accord announced a new partnership with the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise to strengthen cyber capacity building through the exchange of best practices. To further our commitment under that umbrella, we launched a series of webinars to help increase the understanding of key cybersecurity topics, such as the one you will hear today. We welcome you to share your questions in the chat box located to the right hand of your screen, as there will be time at the end of the presentation to address questions. And now I'd like to welcome Dr. Elliot Champion.
Welcome to everyone. My name is Elliot Champion. I'm the Global Product Director for Brand Protection Services. CSC is the world's largest corporate registrar and also protects over 1,000 brands online with monitoring enforcement services. I'm here just to introduce Dr. David Barnett, who's going to be doing the vast majority of this presentation today. He's our subject matter expert for brand monitoring. David has industry-leading experience in domains and also brand protection. Today, David will be sharing his detailed research around online threats, specifically on COVID-19. So David, over to you.
Thanks very much, Elliot. Hello, everyone. So as Elliot said, today we're going to be going through the findings from a series of studies we did over the last 6 weeks or so, looking at how the developing COVID-19 crisis had affected different types of online content. We looked across 5 different areas, which I'm going to give you an overview of the findings from. So the first was looking at coronavirus and COVID-19 related domain names. We also looked at e-commerce marketplaces, mobile apps, phishing, fraud and malware, and social media. And for each of those, we will give you an overview of the findings, followed by some summary of the risks and some recommendations for brand owners in each case. So first of all, we will talk about the findings relating to domain names. For this study, we did a search in late April 2020, looking at the total numbers of registered domains at that time containing COVID-19 or coronavirus related keywords. And at that time, as you can see, there was something like 54,000 registered domains in existence. Many of those featured associated keywords, which implied that the site content was intended to be sort of neutral or informational content and was probably not of high threat. However, a significant number of the domain registrations incorporated other keywords, which were of particular interest or concern, and suggested that the domains may have been registered to take advantage of people's concerns relating to the developing crisis, either for attracting web traffic or to generate revenue for the site owners or to be associated with scams of one sort or another. The keywords we looked at to make those determinations are shown in the table on the right hand side. And as you can see, we divided those into groups as to whether the keywords were related to treatment types, whether they were tracking or testing related keywords, whether there were keywords in the domain name that indicated that the site content may be e-commerce related, looking for references to health-related organizations. And then taking all of those together, we found something like 7,000 domains which had one or more of those keywords, which suggested that the site content may be of particular interest. What we then did was carried out an analysis of the registration dates for the domains which existed at that point using a series of automated lookups. And we were able to pull out data for most of those domains. Well over 6,000 of those domains had an available creation date in the HERES record. So what you're seeing in the graph here is the daily numbers of registrations for that set of domains that existed at that point. And there's a number of kind of key things that come out of this graph, sort of top level findings that are really quite interesting. The first is that obviously, as you can see, there was very, very low levels of registrations at the beginning of the year. And then as the coronavirus crisis ramped up, so did the numbers of domain registrations. You can see that very clearly. The stats relating to that were actually quite striking. So we actually found that all of the domains that we looked up had all been registered since the start of the year, with the first registration on the 17th of January. And actually nearly 90% of the domains that we saw, nearly 5,700 of those domains had been registered since the start of March. so within the final 7 weeks of the analysis period. What's also really interesting is you can track within the domain registration patterns specific external events that actually drove those registrations. So you can see, for example, that when the coronavirus started to emerge around the world outside of China in late January, that's when we started to see a ramp up in the numbers of registrations. There was a big spike on February the 11th, which is the date on which COVID-19 was announced as being the specific strain that was going. Can everyone see my graph, by the way? I've just got a query coming in on chat. Hopefully everyone can see the graph with the spikes.
Yes, I can see the graph.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, I'll carry on. So February the 11th was the date when COVID-19 was announced as a specific strain. And on that date, we saw a big spike of domain names specifically relating to COVID-19. The next real trend after that was when we started to see lockdowns being announced around the world. So, for example, in late February, the largest outbreak in Europe at that time was the one in Italy. That was when they announced their lockdown. And as you can see, that again was associated with a big ramp up in the new domain registrations. The numbers seem to peak in about mid-March. And then from that, we've seen a sort of gradual tail off as things kind of begun to settle down in terms of the domains that are being registered out there. What's also really interesting is that in addition to sort of external drivers, we do see little spikes, or in this case, actually quite a big spike, relating to sort of individual domain registrants. So, for example, you can see labeled there on the right-hand side, a large spike in early April. That was actually registered by all of those domains were registered by a single entity, registering a large number of domain names referring to US cities and the string COVID-19 tests. Now, at the point when we did the analysis, all of those domains were currently still resolved to holding pages, but it'd be really interesting to continue reviewing those going forward to see exactly what that batch of registrations was actually relating to. We wonder whether it may be people driving traffic towards sites that are maybe selling tests for the virus. Okay, so now we start to look in a little bit more detail about that set of 7,000 domains with keywords. Now, we actually found that about 2/3 of those actually produced a live website response. And of those, about 70%, just under 70%, featured actually no active significant content at that time. So they didn't resolve to sort of no content at all, but there was no significant content there. So we saw things like holding pages, placeholder pages of one site, of one sort or another. Now, actually, even those can be quite interesting in their own right for a number of different reasons. Some of those sites might be monetized. So some of them will contain things like pay-per-click links, by which the domain owner is generating revenue as people click on, for example, the sponsored ads on those pages. Some of them may be domain names that are offered for sale. But obviously what we're seeing there is that people are registering domains with names that relate to COVID-19 or coronavirus and other keywords that make those domains quite interesting from a sort of search point of view. And a lot of the people who are being driven to those sites are actually inadvertently, one way or another, generating revenue for the site owner. Now, outside of those 69%, that still leaves over 1,400 domains that did actually result to active websites that are actively being used to generate revenue, be associated with scams of one sort or another. And that's what we'll now delve into in a little bit more detail. Now, of those 1,400 domains, there were about 80 of those that attracted to significant levels of web traffic. And those domains together accounted for something like 43,000 visitors per day. So, you know, there were these domains were attracting a lot of traffic across a lot of users sort of around the globe. Of the top 40 sites by web traffic, the pattern was that the vast majority of those actually resolved to e-commerce sites. So kind of the reason for creating those sites was to sell products and generate revenue. We were seeing a range of different product types being sold on those sites. There are lots of sites selling face masks, as you might imagine. People were seeing other sites selling virus test kits, other healthcare operations. Within the other high traffic sites, there was a range of other content types that we were seeing. There were lots of sites that were offering supported trackers for coronavirus and spreading the disease around the world. There were others, you know, like pharmacies, drugs, treatments, and so on. Various sites providing information on the virus and so on. A couple of examples shown in the screenshots on the right-hand side. You can see the top screenshot and the example from the commerce site, and the bottom site on the trackers. This is just giving you a view of the top sites amongst that list, just giving you some idea of the sort of numbers of those top sites that are received and the types of content. You can see the very, very highly trafficked sites tended to be the trackers, the e-commerce sites, and even some of those sites are getting into thousands of potentially generated traffic. Can everyone hear me actually? Okay, I'm getting some comments that the audio is dropping down.
That is a lot better. Just try one more time.
Okay, so I'll try and speak into the microphone as
No, not your problem at all, David. You know what? I'm still captivated, even though I was only getting half of it. Go on, you carry on.
Sorry, I'll carry on and I'll try and talk as clearly as I can. Okay, so amongst these set of domains, what are the risks we're seeing here? I guess the sort of top level risk is that domain registration is a pretty quick, simple, and essentially unregulated process. So it's very easy for kind of would-be infringers to register a domain, put content on it, and start to monetize that content. So, you know, clearly it's really important to kind of keep track on, keeping an eye on what's out there. As I said, there are various different types of site content we were seeing amongst the domains that were being registered. Lots of those sites, as we've seen, were resolving to e-commerce sites, and again, there can be various risks associated with those. If products being sold are counterfeit or are low quality, there can clearly be safety issues associated with that. In cases where the goods are being sold with a brand name attached to them, so for example, potential counterfeits, there can be obviously reputational issues for the brand that is being counterfeited there, particularly if the items being sold are substandard, as is often the case with counterfeits. And obviously also with e-commerce, we can sometimes see fraud issues, for example, sites taking payments for goods that are never sent. On some of the sites, we see instances of misinformation or phishing, which is often associated with the use of the names of trusted brands or organizations. So on the right-hand side here, this is a screenshot of a purported informational site that was using CDC and World Health Organization branding, but without any legitimate authorization to be doing so. And for various of the tracker websites that we saw, in many cases, we found instances that those are associated with malware or other types of malicious content. And as we'll see in a little bit more detail when we talk about mobile apps and fraud and the other types of issues we're going to be talking about later. So the next few slides is just kind of delving into, in a little bit more detail, some sort of further data analysis for that set of 7,000 domains with keywords of interest that we looked at. So the first thing that we did, as shown here, is to actually compare that against some sort of third-party industry data, which also looked at a large set of domains and gave each one a risk score from 0 to 99, measuring the likelihood that those domains were associated with malicious activity. And that was based on things like sort of similarity to known malicious domains or resemblance to other sites that have been sort of recorded as being involved in spam, phishing, or malware attacks. Now, in that particular metric, domains with a risk score greater than 70 were reported as risky. Now, what's really interesting is that our set of 7,000 domains, the domains that we sort of asserted on the basis of the keywords are likely to be risky, actually this was kind of in close agreement with this third-party source as well. So actually only 428 of our 7,000 domains, so that was only 6%, were not on the risky list provided by this industry data. 56% of our domains had a score of 99, and actually 86% of our domains had a score of over 90. So again, really kind of indicating that the keywords we were looking at are giving us a true indication that actually those domains are likely to genuinely be risky rather than being, for example, legitimate e-commerce sites. In this next slide, what we then did was to look at, again, our 7,000 domains, and to look at the TLDs, so the domain extensions that were being used for those domains. And for those, we split them into what we call the legacy GTLDs, so the global or generic TLDs, so that's things like .com, .net, and so on. The new GTLDs, again, you can see some examples of those on the bottom left. So those are the kind of new extensions that have been released over the last few years, so things like .online, .site, and so on. and the CCTLDs, so those are the country code ones, so things like .co.uk, .de, and so on. And what we're seeing, perhaps not surprisingly, is that the kind of domain landscape is still really very much dominated by the legacy GTLDs. So just under 6,000 of our 7,000 domains were hosted on the GTLDs. And actually, .com actually accounted for 81% of those GTLDs. So still the case that for these types of infringements that we're looking at, .com is still very, very widely used, much more so than any of the other extensions. And that's probably associated with basically the ease with which it is possible to register .com domains. They can be registered through a range of different providers very cheaply. It's very easy to do so. There's no sort of checks or regulations for the types of organizations or entities that are able to register those domains. The next thing we looked at was to take a little bit of a look at MX records. So what we did here was to exclude the domains which we know are interesting by virtue of having active site content, so the 1400 that we looked at before, and that gave us about 5,700 remaining domains, which we split into those which didn't give any live site response altogether, of which there were about 2,400, and those ones which were live but didn't result to any significant site content, so the holding pages and so on, of which there were about 3,300. Now, what we were interested to see here is that clearly someone's gone to the trouble of registering those domains, but they haven't yet set up a website for them. So one thing they could be doing is purely using those domains for their email functionality. So, for example, to create a convincing from address to be associated with maybe a spam campaign or a phishing campaign. And actually what we found was that across those 5,000 odd domains, actually over 20% had active MX records set up, which means that those domains have been configured in such a way that they can send and receive emails. So there's real indication that a lot of these domains are associated with active scams, potentially, even if there's no live site content there. Okay, so looking at domains as a whole, what are the recommendations we can take away from all this? So for a brand owner, it's really key to monitor for any domains that have been registered with domains containing your brand terms or other keywords of interest. Obviously, you know, we've looked specifically at corona-related domains, but obviously a lot of those will also have brand-related content, and it's always really important to keep a tabs on what's going on in the brand landscape to do with domains. So obviously what we're interested in doing is looking for brand related content across a range of content types, the different types of infringement we've seen previously. And it can be really beneficial to use some sort of monitoring technology that's able to actually prioritize those findings. Clearly, you know, there can be lots of domains out there. We want to be able to do things like prioritize by things like the number and prominence of brand mentions, the proximity of those mentions to relevant or threatening keywords, the traffic of the sites, and so on. As we've seen, it can also be really instructive to check any apparently inactive domains to see whether MX records have been set up on those domains, which can give you an indication as to whether maybe those domains are being used for their email functionality. For other domains, even outside of those, it's often really instructive to monitor those domains going forward for changes in content, so using some sort of tracker or revisitor, to sort of get a determination that just because the domain is not interesting at the moment, someone may subsequently upload relevant content in the future, and it's really important to be able to get an early warning of that. And of course, in cases where we identify that there is damaging or infringing content associated with a domain, again, it's really important to use some sort of enforcement action to deactivate those domains to protect customers and your company reputation and revenue. Okay, so now moving on, so that was the longest section. So this a little bit sort of less detail for these ones, just to give you a flavor of the findings that we were seeing in the other areas of internet content. So first of all, we're going to look at online e-commerce marketplaces. So perhaps not surprisingly, the trends we were seeing on marketplaces as the coronavirus developed was obviously a growth in the number of listings for cleaning and hygiene products. This is actually really marked. I mean, Amazon actually banned new listings for certain product classes within these product types in early March, simply to be able to allow them to cope with the demand. Lots of the listings that we were seeing did make explicit reference to coronavirus or COVID-19 in the listing title or description to attract web traffic. So kind of the assumption there is that people will be searching for coronavirus related products on these marketplace sites, and they will be driven to the listings that actually mention those keywords. And obviously, we were seeing lots of listings offering the sale of tests or cures, and that was particularly interesting because a lot of those listings were popping up at times when actually there were no tests or cures. So we could be pretty sure that the things that were being offered were not legitimate products. In terms of the risks that you see on marketplaces for these types of products, obviously the risk you always have with online commerce is the products may not be as described. They can be low quality or ineffectual or counterfeit. And of course, those kind of issues can be particularly concerning when you're talking about health-related products. Obviously, tests, cures, the sorts of things that you're putting in your body, that can be really, really concerning if they're not legitimate. They can be hazardous to health. And if you're talking about ineffectual products, that can obviously lead to a false sense of security. You may be less inclined to worry too much about self-isolation if you think you're using some sort of protection. But if that protection is not effective, then obviously that can be a concern in itself. Lots of the listings also we were seeing utilize the names of trusted brands or organizations, not just for individuals that are selling counterfeits, but also in contexts where those brand names are being used to either claim endorsement or provide the appearance that the items being offered are legitimate when in fact they may not be. So here are a couple of examples of the types of listings we were seeing kind of when we first started doing this research. So the one at the top left is something that was being offered as an anti-coronavirus product. Clearly we're still not really seeing effective cures, so we can be pretty sure that this is not an effective product. But again, it's really interesting to see the way in which these products are being used. The imagery of the baby, really kind of using the emotional hook to try and get people to buy these products. The one at the bottom right is actually really interesting in sort of for some different ways. This was a listing offering the sale of virus test kits. Again, a couple of really important things to sort of pull out of this. The first was they were selling these in very, very high quantities. You can see the minimum order was 100,000 pieces. The other really interesting thing about this listing is they were offering to customize the packaging. Essentially, they will ship these goods out to you with whatever brand logo you like on the packaging. So again, that's a really kind of clear indication that this particular type of listing may well be associated with the supply chain for counterfeit goods. So in terms of recommendations, again, really important to monitor marketplaces, to look for listings that include references to brand terms, and those can sort of arise in a number of different contexts. We've seen, obviously, there can be sites that are selling counterfeits. Brand names can be used for what we call trademark infringements or traffic direction, so used in the title of a listing, even if the listing is not explicitly pretending to offer that brand's product. Simply using the brand somewhere in the listing can drive traffic to that listing if people are searching for brand references. Obviously, we can also see issues to do with things like grey market trade, where legitimate goods are being sold out of the kind of official supply chain. Again, for this monitoring, it can be really instructive to use some sort of monitoring tool that can actually aggregate this information together. So pull out things like quantity and price and aggregate those pieces of data together to provide insight into who the top sellers are and what are the sort of volumes of goods they're offering for sale. Many marketplaces will have IP protection programs that you can utilize as a brand owner to have infringing listings removed. And obviously the aim is to have your kind of top offenders suspended from the marketplace altogether. And there are different ways of doing that based on sort of packaging up and sending the delisting notices in particular ways. Once you've taken down a seller's listing, it is in some cases possible to actually request from the marketplace that seller's details, and that can allow you to do some further on the ground investigation to maybe tie that seller down to a physical location if you wanted to escalate to subsequent legal action or maybe an on the ground investigation or raid. And of course, it's really important for brand owners to educate their customers to sort of be wary of the sorts of things they're buying from marketplaces. So have a look at things like who the seller is that you're buying from, where they're based, look for suspicious features in the product images, check the seller reviews to see if buyers have complained about receiving counterfeit products, and so on. Moving now on to mobile apps. So we saw sort of during the course of our research, we saw lots of instances of coronavirus-related mobile apps being circulated around different sort of app stores and standalone APK sites. And we saw, the main issue here was really that a lot of these trackers were associated with malicious content. Here's a few examples of some of the malicious pieces of software that were documented as being associated with these apps. So there was one called COVID Lock, which threatened to leak users' social media information and delete smartphone storage, and as a Bitcoin ransom was paid. That was actually distributed through a brand-specific domain, coronavirusapp.site, which then linked back to an APK site where the malicious app was being distributed. There was a website that was associated with the malicious app, associated with banking malware. And there was another one that was released called Corona Live 1.1, which again purported to be a legitimate tracker, but actually allowed the people running the app to actually track the people who downloaded it and actually allow them access to those users' smartphone, file storage, cameras, and so on. So again, with some real security issues associated there. As I've mentioned, the apps tend to be from one of two sources. There are the main app stores, which I'm sure most people are familiar with, and there is also these standalone APK sites. The items on those sites tend to have less sort of quality checking associated with them. So what you will often tend to find is that non-legitimate apps will tend to be focused more on the APK sites than the main app stores, although there was a documented instance of an Iranian spyware app being distributed through one of the main app stores before actually the administrators of that store kind of were aware of it and then took it down as a breach of their terms and conditions. So as we've mentioned, you know, the main risk that we were seeing with mobile apps was the association with malware. But obviously, as with any mobile apps, there are other issues that you can see, particularly on the APK sites, as I've mentioned. So even apps that sort of are or purport to be legitimate, they may be not up to date, for example, which would obviously cause them to lack their security patches. And for brand owners, again, branded content can be incorporated in apps in a variety of different contexts. They can obviously be associated with non-legitimate or malicious apps, which obviously can cause brand damage, but also brand content can be used by an app to kind of claim affiliation with the brand owner, maybe make their app appear more credible or look better. And some apps may also incorporate branded content in the form of something like downloadable imagery or streamed content, which can be wrapped up with an app which might be otherwise malicious to try and increase the appeal of that app. So in terms of recommendations, again, really key to just sort of monitor and enforce, look for apps that mention brand references or other keywords of interest. And again, it's really important to look not just at the main app stores, but also at these standalone APK sites where there can be sort of more malicious content floating around. And then if you find infringing on non-legitimate apps, it's really important to carry out enforcement actions to have those apps taken down. That obviously requires you to have appropriate IP protection in place, which is generally needs to be in the form of trademarks registered in the appropriate classes. Now moving on to phishing, fraud, and malware. So obviously this covers a range of different types of issues. There was lots of reports as the crisis began to kick off of lots of spam email campaigns going around, emails that were purporting to provide advice or assistance related to COVID-19, but were actually spreading malicious content in the form of attachments, so in the same way as the apps were doing, or collecting sort of personal details in a sort of phishing context. By mid-March, it was reported that users in the UK had experienced nearly £1 million worth of losses purely through spam email campaigns at that point. Many of the spam emails use the names of trusted organisations to add credibility, and given the nature of the healthcare crisis, things like the World Health Organization and the CDC were the types of organisations that were sort of being abused a lot in these types of campaigns. Many of the emails obviously incorporated malware, as we've talked about earlier. That could be things like trackers, keyloggers, ransomware, the different types of malware that we've talked about. And in some cases, the emails were driving people to copycat websites, maybe copycats of things like healthcare companies, government agencies, and actually the malware was being distributed from those websites. So that was another trend we were also seeing. Many of the emails linked directly to phishing sites or were directly soliciting for payments. There was one example we encountered of an email campaign that was asking for Bitcoin donations, allegedly to aid the CDC in the search for a vaccine, but obviously in reality, the money was just going to the fraudsters. We're also seeing coronavirus references being used as hooks in sort of what we would consider more classic phishing campaigns, so targeting things like the sort of financial service organizations that would typically be more targeted by phishing. We saw a few examples of that where either websites were registered with brand names and COVID-19, or we actually saw one really interesting reference where there were numerous banking phishing types targeting different banks hosted on a mortgage-related domain name in a subdirectory named COVID-19. So again, the assumption there was that somebody was sending out probably phishing campaigns targeting multiple different banks, and again using COVID-19 as part of the hook to try and drive people to sort of re-authenticate with that phishing site. Many of the emails that we saw offered benefits like payday loans, tax rebates. Some were offering things like free iPhones. Again, all just as a hook to try and get you to sort of download attachments, click through to the associated sites, which in many cases were trying to collect your money or distribute malware to you. And obviously, we're also seeing a lot of phishing done through social media via the use of fake accounts. Here are a couple of screenshots of some of the sort of fraudulent emails and sites we were seeing as part of the campaigns. So on the left, this was an email that was purporting to offer COVID-19 business continuity advice, sort of please open these attachments to find out more. But obviously those attachments were malicious, and once you opened them, you had some of this nasty content downloaded to your device. On the right here, we've got what looks to be the official gov.uk website. Actually, what this was a fake version of the website that was associated with an SMS-based phishing scam offering a tax refund. It actually drove the users to a specially constructed site on the domain name coronataxrefunds.com. So this is a wholly non-legitimate site, but you can see the quality of it is pretty good. So that's a pretty convincing type of campaign. So obviously the risks, I think, are fairly clear here. Lots of different phishing sites going on using compelling hooks or fake sites to either collect login details or personal information, or soliciting directly for donations. And obviously a lot of the kind of phishing sites and associated emails were also associated with the distribution of malicious content. So in terms of recommendations, again, it can be really important to use a phishing detection service that will allow you to identify those fraudulent emails and any associated websites that incorporate references to your brand. And then once you've identified that fraudulent content, again, really important to launch timely enforcement actions to have that content deactivated. Most ISPs will accept proof of fraud as a contravention of their terms and conditions, and therefore grounds for takedown. So as long as you've got proof of fraud, it can be pretty quick and effective to have that content taken down. And again, really important also to educate your customers on how to spot suspicious emails themselves in the first place. So things like checking for non-legitimate domain names. So we talked about earlier the domain names of MX records. Some of those, no doubt, have been registered to create emails that use from addresses that are similar to those used by the official company in question. So again, check that the from addresses are the official address. Obviously, always really important to hover over links to check the destination also before you click on a link. And even if all of the domain names and the from addresses look legitimate, again, always important to be aware of the attachments which can contain malicious content. And as for other, for general types of phishing, again, look for the sorts of things that we're all well familiar with seeing in those types of campaign. So generic greetings rather than personalized mails, mails that contain spelling or grammatical errors, anything that conveys urgency, trying to get you to maybe click before you've thought about it clearly, requesting for personal information, and so on. So the final area we want to talk about is social media. So as we mentioned earlier, we did see a lot of phishing related content being distributed via social media channels, but we also saw a lot of other types of fake accounts being set up on social media relating to COVID-19 in one way or another, and being used for other types of scam. Very common were accounts that were sharing incorrect or misleading information. Again, I'm sure you've seen on the news, there's lots of content relating to things like anti-vaccination groups, claims that the virus had been bioengineered by industry or governments, links between COVID-19 and 5G technology. But also we were seeing lots of profiles associated with other types of scam, really tying back to the types of content we've seen earlier in this presentation. So phishing related content, profiles that are driving people to e-commerce sites that are maybe selling counterfeits or substandard products, profiles that are driving people to fake app-based trackers that maybe are associated with malware, and so So the risks really, I mean, social media, like domain names, are susceptible to exploitation by cybercriminals and infringers. Probably even more so than with domain names. It's very, very cheap and easy to set up a fake profile on social media. And given the nature of social media, content of concern can be shared and spread very, very rapidly. So it's really important to keep tabs on what's out there. Many social media sites are quite sort of proactive to try and remove harmful content, but the sheer numbers of things that are being put up there means that some content invariably will creep through. So it's really important as a brand owner to make sure that you're monitoring this and taking it down as quickly as you can once you see sort of harmful content out there. And as we've discussed, references to brands can be used in conjunction with things like misinformation or other infringing content, and that can actually result in reputational damage. So in terms of our recommendations, as for the other areas, it's really important to monitor for brand references in profiles, usernames, and posts. And then once you've identified that infringing content, most of these social media sites will have IP protection programs through which you can request delistings, although the criteria and enforcement requirements will vary from site to site. One really interesting case study that cropped up on our radar, one of our customers, a technology provider, actually reported that the identification of 2 videos claiming that their 5G technology products had caused the coronavirus and that the company was attempting to cover it up. So they came to us and they asked for our help in taking it down. We actually requested the removal of the content on multiple grounds, including breaches of trademark and the social media site policy. And actually that resulted in that harmful content, which could have otherwise resulted in significant reputational damage for our customer, actually being successfully removed from the social media site within 3 hours. From a brand owner, sort of moving now slightly outside the areas of kind of classic brand monitoring, it's also really important to work with marketing service providers to control where your own marketing content is being placed. So obviously a lot of brand owners will have adverts that are served onto third-party sites by some sort of marketing service provider. And obviously some of those third-party sites will have content on them, misinformation, for example, that the brand owner will not want to be associated with. So again, it's really important to be proactive about making sure that to be really careful about where your marketing content is being served up. Plus, it's also, I mean, sort of moving away from sort of just thinking about brand owners, it's also really important to sort of take away that actually individual users can also request the removal of generic, non-branded harmful content from social media using a variety of public online tools which cover all matters outside of IP issues. And in general, social media sites will usually be compliant with the requests for the removal of such content just by virtue of its harmful nature. So that's everything from me. So just going to sort of throw it open to see if there's any questions from anyone.
Well, firstly, I'll just say thank you very much, David. I really, really appreciate it. I think whilst we've covered a lot of different things and we see a lot of these things highlighted in the media, I think no one's really looked at this across all these different spectrums and highlighted it. So thank you very much for sharing your research and also your recommendations throughout. I kind of invite everyone at this point to share any questions that they have through the chat bar, and as and when they come in. We do have a couple of those that were sent over before, but until then, whilst everyone can think or maybe want to type theirs up, I'll just go through a couple of these now. So first one, David, was can you re-explain what APK App Store is?
Yeah, absolutely, no problem. So for mobile apps, what we tend to find is that mobile apps are distributed from sort of 2 main classes of sources. So there are the main app stores, so that's things like iTunes, Google Play, main sort of sources of mobile apps that people are generally more familiar with. Those tend to be pretty rigorously quality checked by the organizations that run those app stores. And in most cases, the content on those app stores tends to be sort of safer to use. You also find the other type of source, which are these APK sites. So they're called APK sites because the name APK refers to Android package, which is a kind of file format used for the distribution of, so essentially for Android type apps. And there are lots of these third-party sites that distribute these APK files. People use them for a variety of different reasons. Sometimes you can get early releases, you can get versions of apps that are maybe no longer available through the main app stores. The problem with those APK sites is that they are less rigorously checked. It's much easier for sort of unsavory and unofficial content to get posted on those sites. So just as a user, it's just really important to be wary of what you're downloading from those sites. Now, as we've seen, some of the apps on those sites may be associated with malware. Some of them may not be what they claim to be, so they may appear to be a listing for an official app, but actually what you download is not necessarily what the site is offering. Even if it is the official app and it is kind of what it claims to be, often on these APK sites, the content is not updated as often as it would be on one of the main app stores. So you might find if you download something from an APK site, you're actually getting an older version that has been sort of superseded by one that has got more up-to-date things like security patches and fixes on it. So again, if you download something from that APK site, there is always a possibility that there may be security holes that hackers can kind of use to access your device. Does that make sense?
Very thorough answer. Thank you very much, David. Always learning something new. Are there, another question here is, are there any regionally specific issues, any that you've kind of found? I suppose it's a hard question, but any that you found within the research that you've done?
No, we didn't see anything sort of specific in terms of regionality. I mean, that's often the case when it comes to sort of, any type of broad internet sweep of this nature. I mean, internet content by its very nature is kind of global in reach. I guess the things to take away is that, when we look for things like the CCTLD patterns used in the domain registrations, actually they were very, very sort of small proportions of what we were seeing compared with things like the global TLDs, things like .com. I guess, the other sort of aspect you will see to regionality is the types of brands and organizations that are kind of being abused, I guess. So, for example, if you're looking at, trying to scam a US-based audience, you'd be more inclined maybe to use a reference to the CDC rather than the World Health Organization. But beyond that, I don't think there are any particular trends that we picked up that are kind of worth remarking on here.
Okay, and then the final one, which I think you answered as you went through, but it was just a quick one on what industries appear to have been hit hardest. I know you noted as you went through specifically some client case studies that we've seen in the past few weeks and months, and you spoke about financials in particular. But are there any particular industries that are of note?
So that's actually really interesting. Kind of sort of lends itself to a bit of an open question. I mean, what we started seeing when we started looking at sort of coronavirus-related content generally is that the types of scams that were being used most were the ones where coronavirus itself was being used as a hook. So almost like coronavirus was the brand that was being abused, if you want to think of it in those terms. Actually, sort of general branded infringements didn't see a corresponding increase. And actually, if anything, for the sorts of lower priority brand infringements, things like claims of affiliation, those types of things, we actually, if anything, saw a slight tail off in those, almost as if the infringers were sort of stepping aside from the sort of branding infringements that they would normally concentrate on and actually focusing on coronavirus as a hook. Now, actually, it'd be really interesting to see how that pattern kind of continues as we move out of the crisis. Do we expect it to go back to sort of how it was previously, or actually do we expect it to go back to a slightly higher level of that sort of background infringements now that more people have got used to sort of doing their business online, for example, as they've been encouraged to sort of work from home, rely more on the internet to kind of get deliveries and products and so on. That said, I think, there were a few sort of particular industry types that we saw sort of in the infringements that we were seeing. Obviously, any manufacturers of things like medical or healthcare products, they were seeing things like their products counterfeited, as you might expect. Not least because there was a big market for these products, and actually the legitimate manufacturers were struggling to keep up with demand. So that kind of really opened the door for counterfeiters to put out products actually, to meet the demand that was out there. Obviously, we've talked about the trusted organizations, so your CDC, your World Health Organization. They obviously are very sort of susceptible to being kind of used in scams to try and sort of lend legitimacy to those scams. And obviously, we've also, as you say earlier, we've talked about financial services organizations, which are kind of always targeted by the types of phishing activity that will sometimes tend to ramp up in contexts like this. But they're not the only ones we were seeing. I mean, we saw some smaller cases where things like media and entertainment companies were being targeted. So various scams that were offering, things like a 1 month extra trial on your Netflix, for example, and you click on that, and it maybe takes you to a site that's got malware. It maybe takes you to a site that's stealing your login details. With everything else that was going on, people working online, we saw various things like gambling websites being targeted by denial of service attacks. Obviously, a lot of sites where kind of online is their business model, they were seeing sort of extra business whilst people were sort of spending more time logged on. And obviously that then obviously makes you sort of susceptible to things like these denial of service attacks. So I would say they're probably the main things we were seeing. So yeah, I think sort of to summarize, yes, lots of different industries targeted, but with obviously this kind of thread of things being used with specifically coronavirus as the hook rather than necessarily the brand as the hook.
Excellent.
If that makes sense.
Well, thank you very much for your time today, David, and thank you very much for compiling all this research and sharing it with everyone. I'll pass back over to Silas if he wants to do any closing comments.
Yeah, thank you so much, David and Elliot and CSC for this great presentation on this very timely topic. Be on the lookout for future Tech Accord webinars coming up. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone.